After graduation, I worked as a waitress to make ends meet. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Brad Morrison, our former class president turned investment banking VP, burst into laughter that echoed off the restaurant's crystal chandeliers. A waitress? He nearly choked on his $300 bottle of wine. Hannah, what are you even doing here? This isn't some Applebee's where you can split the check 8 ways. The others joined in, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Designer suits, Rolex watches, and Harvard MBA degrees suddenly became weapons pointed directly at the woman who'd served other people's food while they'd climbed corporate ladders built from family money and networking connections. Seriously, Brad continued, his voice dripping with practiced cruelty, can you even afford to be here? Because if you need to borrow money. I smiled, my fingers steady on the wine glass worth more than their monthly car payments. They had no idea whose restaurant they were sitting in, but soon they would. My name is Hannah, 37 years old. I once carried trays heavier than my dreams, served tables that nobody remembered, and smiled through shifts that lasted longer than most people's workdays. But I never forgot a single insult, every condescending look, or the way people's eyes would slide past me like I was furniture with legs. The smell still haunts me sometimes, that mixture of grease, spilled beer, and industrial-strength floor cleaner that clung to my uniform like a second skin. Danny's Diner on Queens Boulevard, where the fluorescent lights buzzed angry as wasps and the vinyl booths were held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. I was 22 when I started there, fresh out of Harvard Business School with an MBA that felt more like a participation trophy than a ticket to success. While my classmates were landing analyst positions at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, I was learning that student loan payments didn't care about your degree or your potential. They just wanted their money every month. Regular as clockwork. The greasy apron became my uniform, polyester that never quite came clean no matter how many times I washed it in the basement laundromat of my studio apartment in Astoria. Midnight shifts were the worst, when the bar crowd stumbled in demanding coffee they wouldn't drink and food they'd barely remember ordering, leaving tips that insulted both my intelligence and my rent obligations. My feet would blister in shoes I couldn't afford to replace, standing on linoleum that had been mopped with the same dirty water since the Clinton administration. But it was the way customers looked at me that really carved into my soul, like I was some kind of cautionary tale about what happens when you don't work hard enough, don't want success badly enough, don't have the right connections or the right last name. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday when the moment that changed everything happened. The diner was nearly empty except for a few regulars nursing coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dinner rush. A businessman in an expensive suit, the kind that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, sat alone at booth 7, picking at eggs Benedict like he was performing surgery. When I approached with the coffee pot, he looked up at me with eyes that held all the warmth of a corporate layoff notice. You know, he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty that comes from never having to worry about rent, waitresses like you never get anywhere. This is it for people like you, carrying other people's food until you're too old to stand up straight. I stood there holding that coffee pot, my hands steady despite the fire building in my chest, and nodded like his observation was some kind of profound wisdom instead of a deliberate attempt to crush whatever dreams he assumed I didn't deserve to have. Yes, sir, I said, my voice level as a carpenter's tool. Would you like more coffee? But as I walked away from that booth, I tucked his words deep into my heart, like a blade I'd sharpen every day until it was ready to cut through every assumption he'd ever made about people like me. My father had been a bus driver for the MTA, spending 30 years navigating New York traffic that could break strong men and stronger marriages. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil and subway grime, but when he came home to our Bronx apartment, he'd sit at our kitchen table and talk about dreams like they were blueprints waiting to be built. Every empire starts with one small step, Mija. He'd tell me while my mother heated up leftover rice and beans, his weathered fingers tracing patterns on our Formica table that had seen better decades. The people who build something real, they don't start at the top. They start where nobody's watching and work until everybody has to notice. My mother was different, quieter, but with a strength that ran deeper than subway tunnels. She worked at a garment factory in Queens, coming home with fingers pricked by needles and eyes strained from fluorescent lighting. But every night she'd sit by the window mending our clothes with the kind of precision that turned necessity into art. Don't let them shame you for working, she'd whisper while her needle moved through fabric like a conductor's baton through a symphony. One day, they'll eat at your table, and you'll decide whether they deserve to stay. Those words became my armor during the shifts that stretched like marathons, when my feet screamed for relief and my dignity felt like something I'd pawned for tip money. Every night, I'd ride the subway back to Astoria, watching my reflection in windows that showed a woman in a grease-stained uniform who smelled like other people's dinner and disappointment. But as that train rocked through Queens tunnels that had carried millions of dreams and broken hearts, I'd close my eyes and repeat the same words like a mantra that kept me breathing. This isn't my ending. The businessman at booth 7 had meant to break me with his casual cruelty. Instead, he'd given me something more valuable than any tip, the fuel to prove that waitresses like me don't just get somewhere. We build the places everyone else wishes they could go. The mason jar under my bed held everything: crumpled dollar bills, quarters that smelled like coffee grounds, and the occasional 20 from customers who'd actually appreciated service that went beyond the minimum wage requirements. 3 years of saving tips, working double shifts, and eating ramen noodles for dinner, while my Harvard classmates posted Instagram photos from Michelin-starred restaurants they could afford without checking their bank accounts. Every night after Danny's Diner closed, I'd sit at my kitchen table under a lamp I'd bought at a garage sale, spreading business plans across surfaces sticky with spilled coffee and determination. The numbers had to work: rent, utilities, food costs, labor, insurance, permits, and 1,000 other expenses that business school had taught me to calculate but never explained how to finance when banks looked at your credit score and laughed. I studied menus like scripture, analyzing why certain dishes worked and others failed, breaking down flavor profiles and cost margins, with the obsession of someone who understood that knowing the difference between profit and bankruptcy often came down to the price of tomatoes. Recipe notebooks filled with my handwriting covered every surface of my studio apartment: scribbled modifications, supplier contacts, and cooking techniques I'd learned from YouTube videos when I couldn't afford culinary school. The location was everything I could afford and nothing I wanted: a corner spot in Astoria where foot traffic was lighter than my bank account, and the previous 3 restaurants had failed with the regularity of New York subway delays. But the rent was reasonable, the kitchen equipment worked most of the time, and the landlord was desperate enough to accept a security deposit paid in cash from a mason jar. Hannah's Corner Cafe opened on a Tuesday morning in October when the autumn light filtered through windows I'd cleaned with newspaper and vinegar because professional window washing was a luxury I couldn't justify. 6 tables, each one wobbling slightly because I'd bought them secondhand and couldn't afford repairs. Lights that flickered when trucks drove past, casting shadows that danced across walls I'd painted myself in colors that hid stains and suggested warmth. But it was mine. The first customer was Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment building next door, who ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin I'd baked at 4 a.m. She paid with exact change and left a $1 tip that felt like validation wrapped in currency. Failure hit like a physical blow 6 weeks later. The morning rush I'd anticipated never materialized. Lunch crowds went to the established deli down the street where they knew the food and trusted the prices. Dinner customers drove to restaurants with parking and reputations built over decades rather than dreams built over sleepless nights. Bills arrived with mathematical precision: rent, utilities, food supplier invoices, insurance premiums that reminded me daily how thin the line was between small business owner and former small business owner. Some nights, I'd sit alone in my empty cafe, counting the day's receipts that barely covered the cost of ingredients, wondering if the businessman at booth 7 had been right about waitresses like me. The lowest point came on a Thursday when only 2 customers showed up all day: a teenager who bought a Coke and used the Wi-Fi for 3 hours, and an elderly man who ordered tea and left without paying. I locked the door at closing time, turned off the flickering lights, and stood in darkness that smelled like unused potential and mounting debt. That's when I pulled out the notebook I'd carried since Danny's Diner, the one filled with recipes and business plans and dreams that suddenly felt heavier than the trays I used to carry. On the last page, I wrote a single line with a pen that was running out of ink: "One day, this name will shine across the city." I refused to close, not because I was brave, but because I was too stubborn to give every person who'd ever dismissed me the satisfaction of being right. The turnaround began with small changes: better coffee from a supplier who believed in my vision enough to extend credit, homemade soups that filled the cafe with aromas that drew people in from the street, and service that made customers feel like guests rather than transactions. Word spread the way good food always does in New York. One satisfied customer telling another, Yelp reviews that mentioned the hidden gem in Astoria, food bloggers who discovered that sometimes the best meals come from places that don't look like much from the outside. Year by year, the numbers changed. Profit margins that had been theoretical became actual. The wobbly tables were replaced with sturdy ones. The flickering lights gave way to professional fixtures. The single location became 2, then 3, then a chain that stretched across Queens and into Manhattan. Newspapers started calling me the woman who fed the city. Food and Wine magazine featured Hannah's Corner Cafe in their Rising Stars issue. The James Beard Foundation sent an invitation to their annual awards ceremony, not as a winner, but as someone they were watching. But the moment that really mattered happened 5 years after opening, when I walked into the original Astoria location and saw it filled with families sharing meals, couples on first dates, and business meetings over coffee that had become part of the neighborhood's rhythm. The mason jar under my bed was long gone, replaced by business accounts and investment portfolios, but I still kept that notebook, the one with the line about my name shining across the city. Some dreams take longer to come true than others. The trick is staying awake long enough to see them happen. 20 years. That's how long it had been since I'd seen most of these faces, and walking into the Harvard Business School reunion felt like stepping into a museum exhibit titled, People Who Peak Early and Never Recover. The invitation had arrived 6 months ago, embossed cardstock that probably cost more than most people's grocery budgets, announcing the reunion would be held at Le Bernardin, Manhattan's crown jewel of fine dining, where reservations required either serious money or serious connections, and sometimes both. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple black dress from Nordstrom, nothing designer, nothing flashy, no diamonds except the small studs my mother had given me for graduation, no Hermes bag or Christian Louboutin shoes that screamed, "Look how successful I am." Just me, walking into a room where success was measured by the size of your bonus and the thread count of your business cards. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. Brad Morrison stood near the bar wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, his Patek Philippe watch catching the soft lighting as he gestured expansively about his latest acquisition deal. Around him clustered our former classmates, all of them displaying wealth like peacocks showing off their feathers. Jennifer Walsh, who'd landed at Morgan Stanley straight out of school, wore a dress that I recognized from a Vogue spread, retail price somewhere around $5,000. Her engagement ring could have funded a small restaurant for 6 months, and she wore it like a trophy that announced her worth to anyone within viewing distance. Hannah. Oh my God, I can't believe you're here. The voice belonged to Lisa Chen, who'd married a tech billionaire and now spent her time on charity boards and Instagram posts from private jets. She air-kissed me with the enthusiasm of someone performing for an audience rather than greeting an old friend. What have you been up to? Are you still in New York? Are you married? Kids? The questions came rapid fire, but her eyes were already scanning the room for more important conversations, more valuable networking opportunities. I'm still in the city, I said, keeping my voice level. Running a small business, actually. That caught her attention. Oh, how exciting! What kind of business? The moment of truth arrived faster than I'd expected. Around us, conversations about IPOs and summer houses in the Hamptons continued, but I could feel the shift in attention as people tuned into our exchange with the subtle precision of sharks sensing blood in the water. After graduation, I said softly, the words feeling heavier than they should, I worked as a waitress to make ends meet. The effect was instantaneous. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. The soft murmur of successful people congratulating each other on their success gave way to the kind of silence that precedes either applause or execution. Then Brad Morrison's laughter erupted across the restaurant like a gunshot in a library, deep, rich, and completely lacking in warmth. It echoed off Le Bernardin's carefully designed acoustic surfaces and drew the attention of diners at nearby tables who were probably wondering what could be so amusing about someone's career trajectory. A waitress? The word fell from his lips like he was tasting something unpleasant. Hannah, what are you even doing here? This dinner costs more than most people make in a week. The laughter spread like wildfire. Jennifer's perfectly glossed lips curved into a smirk that had probably been practiced in boardroom mirrors. Lisa covered her mouth with manicured fingers, but her eyes sparkled with the cruel delight that comes from watching someone else's humiliation unfold in real time. Seriously, Brad continued, his investment banker confidence inflated by the audience of former classmates who hung on his every word. This isn't some Applebee's where you can split the check 8 ways and leave a 10% tip. Can you even afford to be here? The mockery felt like physical blows, each laugh a reminder of every assumption they'd made about people who worked service jobs, every stereotype about education being wasted on those who couldn't translate degrees into corner offices and 7-figure salaries. Around the table, I watched faces I'd once studied with, people I'd shared late-night cramming sessions and group projects with, now looking at me like I was a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't network hard enough or marry rich enough, or sell your soul completely enough to the corporate machine that had elevated them. But I didn't flinch, didn't defend myself, didn't explain that I'd chosen a different path or that service work had taught me more about business than their boardrooms ever could. Instead, I sat perfectly still, my fingers steady on the wine glass that cost more than their monthly parking fees, and waited. The same patience I'd learned during those midnight shifts at Danny's Diner, when drunk customers would test my composure, and I'd smile through insults that were designed to break people who couldn't break. They had no idea whose restaurant they were sitting in, but they would. The businessman at Booth 7 had been wrong about waitresses like me. We didn't just get somewhere. We owned the places where people like them came to feel important. And tonight, they were about to learn the difference between earning respect and buying it, between building something real and inheriting something hollow, between knowing the price of everything and understanding the value of nothing. The reunion was just getting started. The mockery was still echoing through Le Bernardin's dining room when everything changed. Brad Morrison was mid-sentence, explaining to the table why people like me would never understand real success, when the restaurant's main doors opened with the whisper of expensive hinges and precision engineering. Antoine Dubois, Le Bernardin's general manager, entered the dining room carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His presence commanded immediate attention, the kind of quiet authority that comes from running one of the world's most prestigious restaurants, where a single reservation can make or break careers and reputations. But it wasn't his entrance that made my heart skip. It was the way his eyes scanned the room with practiced efficiency, moving past tables filled with Manhattan's elite, past celebrities and CEOs and old money families who treated Le Bernardin like their personal dining room. His gaze stopped when it found me. The general manager of the most exclusive restaurant in New York City was walking directly toward our table, his expression carrying the kind of professional urgency that suggested whatever was in that portfolio couldn't wait until morning. Around me, my Harvard classmates were still processing Brad's latest insult about my ability to afford the wine when Antoine approached with the measured steps of someone who understood that in establishments like this, even the way you walked sent messages about power and precision. "Excusez-moi," he said, his French accent lending gravity to words that cut through the ambient noise of expensive conversation and clinking crystal. "I apologize for the interruption." The table fell silent with the abruptness of a conductor cutting off an orchestra. Brad's smirk froze halfway across his face, his investment banker confidence suddenly uncertain in the presence of someone whose opinion actually mattered in this rarefied environment. Antoine's eyes found mine across the table, and something shifted in his expression, the subtle recognition that passes between professionals who understand the weight of real responsibility. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet table with the clarity of cathedral bells, "the new multi-million-dollar expansion contract requires your signature before we can proceed with tomorrow's board meeting." The words landed like artillery shells in the middle of their comfortable assumptions about who belonged at this table and who was merely visiting. Multi-million-dollar contract, board meeting, your signature. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Jennifer Walsh's wine glass slipped from her manicured fingers, the burgundy spreading across white tablecloth like spilled blood. The sound of crystal hitting marble echoed through the dining room, with the finality of dreams shattering. Lisa Chen's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, her charity board sophistication evaporating in the face of numbers that dwarfed her husband's tech millions. The engagement ring that had seemed so impressive 30 seconds ago now looked like costume jewelry next to the kind of wealth that bought restaurants instead of meals. But it was Brad Morrison's reaction that really captured the magnitude of what was happening. His face drained of color until it matched the expensive linen napkin he was clutching like a life preserver, his Patek Philippe watch suddenly seeming like a child's toy compared to the kind of power that required general managers to personally deliver contracts at dinner parties. Forks clattered to marble floors like metallic rain as hands lost their ability to hold utensils. The sophisticated chatter that had filled Le Bernardin's dining room gave way to silence so profound that I could hear the gentle hum of the kitchen's ventilation system and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below. 20 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief to the kind of recognition that comes when someone realizes they've been catastrophically wrong about everything. The woman they'd dismissed as an unemployable waitress was being addressed by Le Bernardin's general manager about multi-million-dollar contracts that required her personal approval. "Of course, Antoine," I said, my voice carrying across the silent table with the calm authority of someone who'd been signing important documents for years. "I'll review the expansion details after dinner." The leather portfolio exchanged hands with the precision of a military operation, Antoine's bow carrying the respect reserved for people whose decisions affected hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. "Merci beaucoup, madame. The architectural plans for the new locations are particularly impressive." New locations, plural. The words hung in the air like smoke from expensive cigars, adding another layer to the revelation that was reshaping everything my former classmates thought they understood about success, power, and the woman they'd been mocking for the last 20 minutes. As Antoine withdrew with the same quiet efficiency that had marked his entrance, I could feel the weight of recognition settling over the table like winter fog. The simple black dress that had seemed so modest now looked like the kind of understated elegance that comes from having nothing to prove. The absence of designer jewelry transformed from evidence of financial limitation to proof that real wealth doesn't need announcement. Brad Morrison tried to speak first, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Hannah, we didn't. How did you?" But words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of their miscalculation. The woman they'd laughed at for working as a waitress didn't just own restaurants. She owned the restaurant they were sitting in, the same establishment where they'd come to feel important and exclusive. The wine they'd been drinking, the food they'd been eating, the very chairs they'd been sitting in while mocking my service industry background, all of it belonged to the woman they'd dismissed as someone who would never amount to anything. The silence stretched like an eternity, broken only by the sound of their assumptions crumbling and the distant clink of crystal as other diners continued their meals, unaware that they were witnessing the moment when 20 years of condescension met the reality of who actually held the power in this room. I smiled, my fingers steady on the wine glass that I'd been using to toast my own success while they celebrated careers that suddenly seemed very small in comparison. The reunion was about to get much more interesting. The silence that followed Antoine's departure was so profound that I could hear the gentle clink of silverware from other tables, the muffled conversations of diners who had no idea they were witnessing the collapse of 20 years' worth of assumptions about success, failure, and who deserved to sit at which tables. Brad Morrison's face had gone through several color changes since the revelation, from his usual investment banker tan to pale white to a sickly green that suggested his expensive dinner might not stay down much longer. His mouth opened and closed like he was practicing speeches he'd never have the courage to deliver. Around the table, my former classmates sat frozen in various stages of shock and recognition. Jennifer Walsh stared at the wine stains spreading across the white tablecloth like she was watching her entire worldview dissolve in real time. Lisa Chen clutched her purse with the desperate grip of someone who'd just realized that charity board connections meant nothing compared to actually owning the charity. But it was the way they avoided eye contact that really told the story. 20 minutes ago, they'd been looking at me with the casual dismissal reserved for people they considered beneath their notice. Now they stared at their plates, their hands, their wine glasses, anywhere except at the woman who'd just been revealed as the owner of the establishment where they'd come to feel important. "Hannah." Brad's voice cracked like ice under pressure. We didn't know. How were we supposed to?" The stammering was almost painful to watch. This was the same man who'd commanded boardrooms, closed million-dollar deals, and negotiated with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Now he was struggling to form complete sentences while addressing the woman he'd mocked for not being able to afford dinner. I let him struggle for a moment, watching the wheels turn behind eyes that were finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their miscalculation. The simple black dress I wore wasn't evidence of financial limitation. It was the kind of understated elegance that comes from having nothing to prove to anyone. "You didn't know," I said finally, my voice carrying across the table with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions in revenue. "Because you didn't want to know." The words landed with surgical precision. Around the table, faces that had been flushed with wine and laughter now carried the pale complexion of people processing uncomfortable truths about themselves and their assumptions. "The night you mocked me for being a waitress," I continued, each word measured and deliberate as the contract signatures I'd been reviewing for the past 5 years, "was the night I swore I'd own the table you wouldn't let me sit at." The metaphor wasn't lost on them. They were sitting in my restaurant, eating my food, drinking my wine, surrounded by decor I'd approved and service standards I'd established. The table they'd claimed I didn't belong at was literally mine. Every marble surface, every crystal glass, every thread in the tablecloth that was now stained with Jennifer's spilled wine. "Hannah, we were young. We were stupid." Jennifer's voice trailed off as she realized how hollow the words sounded. Young and stupid didn't excuse the casual cruelty that had dismissed someone's worth based on how they earned their living. "You were privileged," I corrected, my tone carrying no malice, just the kind of factual observation that comes from years of watching people mistake inherited advantages for personal achievements. "You confused having money with earning respect, confused connections with competence, confused knowing the right people with being the right person." Lisa Chen finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than the confident social register she'd been using all evening. "We should have known. He should have recognized." "Should have recognized what?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she planned to finish that sentence. "That someone who worked in service might actually understand service better than people who'd only ever received it? That someone who'd built a business from nothing might have insights about business that trust fund babies never develop?" The questions hung in the air like indictments, each one forcing them to confront assumptions they'd never examined because they'd never had to. In their world, success was measured by the size of your apartment and the exclusivity of your country club membership. They'd never considered that real power might look different, might speak differently, might choose to dress down rather than show off. "The businessman who told me waitresses never get anywhere," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "was right about one thing. We don't just get somewhere. We build the places where people like you come to feel important." The laughter that had filled this table 30 minutes ago was gone, replaced by the heavy silence that comes when people realize they've been fundamentally wrong about everything. No one dared meet my eyes now, the same eyes they'd looked past with dismissive glances, the same face they'd smiled at with condescending pity. Respect had been forced into the room with the weight of a multi-million-dollar revelation, but it was hollow respect, the kind that comes from recognizing power rather than acknowledging worth. They weren't seeing me differently because they'd learned to value service work or appreciate the journey from working class to business ownership. They were treating me with deference because they'd discovered I had more money than they'd assumed. But that was enough for now. Sometimes you have to teach people to respect your power before they can learn to respect your humanity. I stood up slowly, the movement commanding immediate attention from every person at the table. My simple black dress rustled softly against the leather chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, a chair in my restaurant, at my table, surrounded by my success. "Dinner is on the house tonight," I said, reaching for my purse with the same steady hands that had once carried trays and now signed expansion contracts. "Consider it a reunion gift from someone who apparently doesn't belong at tables like this." The irony wasn't subtle, and from their expressions, it wasn't lost on them either. The woman they'd tried to exclude from their circle was now literally paying for their privilege to sit in her establishment. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel their eyes following me with a mixture of shame, awe, and the kind of recognition that comes too late to matter. The simple dress that had seemed so unremarkable when I'd entered now looked like exactly what it was, the choice of someone who'd never needed designer labels to announce her worth. Behind me, the reunion continued without its most successful graduate. But then again, I'd already graduated from needing their approval. As I walked toward the exit of Le Bernardin, Antoine approached me one final time, the leather portfolio still in his hands, his expression carrying the professional urgency that had become familiar over our 5 years of working together. "Madam," he said quietly, positioning himself so our conversation wouldn't carry to the table of stunned Harvard graduates behind us. If you have a moment, the expansion contract requires your final signature before tomorrow's board meeting. The timing was perfect, almost too perfect, like destiny had decided to underscore the lesson with one final dramatic flourish. I took the portfolio, feeling the weight of paper that represented millions in investment, hundreds of jobs, and the next phase of an empire that had started with a mason jar full of tips and a refusal to accept other people's limitations. The pen felt familiar in my hands. The same steady grip that had once balanced trays now controlled the future of restaurants across 3 states. As I signed my name with the practiced precision of someone who'd been making million-dollar decisions for years, I could feel the weight of 23 pairs of eyes from surrounding tables, all of them watching the woman they'd dismissed sign documents that would reshape Manhattan's dining landscape. The acquisition had closed 6 months ago, a purchase that had been covered in Food and Wine, The Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. But tonight was the first time I'd dined here since the papers were signed, the first time I'd sat at these tables as a customer rather than the owner reviewing quarterly reports and staff evaluations. The irony was so perfect it could have been scripted. They'd chosen my own restaurant as the venue to explain why someone like me would never succeed in their world. As I handed the signed contract back to Antoine, I caught Brad Morrison watching from the corner of my eye. His face still carried the pale complexion of someone processing the magnitude of their miscalculation, but there was something else there now, a recognition that went deeper than financial surprise. They thought waiting tables was failure, I said, my voice carrying just loud enough for him to hear, though I wasn't speaking to him directly. They didn't see it was training to serve not just plates, but destiny. Every skill I'd learned during those midnight shifts at Danny's Diner had become the foundation of an empire they couldn't have imagined, understanding what customers wanted before they asked, managing stress under pressure, reading people's needs from body language and tone, building relationships based on service rather than status. The Harvard Business School education had given me frameworks and theories, but it was the calloused hands and aching feet that had taught me what hospitality actually meant, what excellence looked like when it wasn't performed for grades but earned through tips that paid the rent. I stood slowly, my chair sliding back with the whisper of leather against marble that had been designed to announce importance without shouting about it. The simple black dress that had seemed so unremarkable when I'd entered now carried the weight of someone who'd proven that real elegance comes from confidence rather than labels. Walking past their table felt like closing a chapter that had been 20 years in the writing. The silence that followed my steps was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Antoine's revelation. This was the profound stillness that comes when people realize they've witnessed something that will change how they was like heartedly 7. See the world. Their shame was palpable, hanging in the air like expensive perfume that couldn't quite cover the scent of regret. Jennifer Walsh stared at her spilled wine like it was a crystal ball, showing her all the assumptions she'd need to reconsider. Lisa Chen clutched her purse with hands that trembled slightly, probably calculating how many charity events she'd need to attend to feel important again. But it was Brad's expression that really captured the transformation. The investment banker who'd commanded rooms with his confidence now looked like a man who'd just learned that all his measurements of success had been using the wrong scale entirely. As I reached the exit, Manhattan's autumn air hit my face with the crisp promise of new beginnings. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy. Millions of people chasing dreams, building empires, serving tables, and learning that success isn't about where you start but about refusing to accept other people's definitions of where you belong. My phone buzzed with a text from my head chef at the original Astoria location. "Boss, we just hit another record night." The line still around the block. I smiled, remembering the woman who'd opened Hannah's Corner Cafe with wobbly tables and flickering lights who'd written, "One day, this name will shine across the city in a notebook she couldn't afford to lose." That woman had been right about everything except the scale. The name didn't just shine across the city, it lit up 3 states and counting, carried by people who understood that true hospitality means serving others with dignity, rather than serving yourself with others' labor. Behind me, Le Bernardin continued its evening service, its staff providing the kind of excellence that comes from understanding that every customer deserves respect regardless of their ability to tip. The same values I'd learned carrying trays now guided servers across 12 locations, creating experiences that turned meals into memories. I walked into the Manhattan night not as the waitress they'd mocked, but as the empire they would never forget. The mason jar under my bed was long gone, replaced by quarterly reports that made headlines and board meetings that shaped industries. But I still carried the notebook, the one with the line about shining across the city. Some promises take longer to fulfill than others. The trick is keeping them anyway. If Hannah's story reminded you that being dismissed by the wrong people just means you're on your way to the right success, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. What moment in her journey hit you the hardest? Share this video with someone who's been underestimated because of how they earn their living. Drop a comment telling me about a time someone judged your worth by your job title instead of your character, or when you witnessed someone turn mockery into motivation. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't proving them wrong about you, it's building something so undeniable that they have to eat their words in the restaurants you own. Until next time, keep serving excellence, not because they deserve it, but because you're training for the empire only you can see coming.